Okay, so we can think of this as an exam review program. I have a lot of techniques involved here, and basically it's an album of European castles. So I can scroll through the castles. So, apparently I just have 3 of them in there. 3 castles in the album, that's static data. We'll look at that again. I do have an about form, and not much there, but you can see launching Form 2 from Form 1. Okay, so really the real feature here is going to be the array of objects with the constructor in the class. So let's take a look at the class. I have a class called Castle, and I have a few private data members here. The name of the castle, the country, the year it was built, a picture, and we talked about the static data. If they're all looking at the same number, the count of 3, because we have 3 castles here, there's no point in each of them having its own copy. It just makes sense to have that one location in memory where they can all access that same number 3. Okay, if we're going to do that though, however, we have to increment that static data every time a constructor executes, because when a constructor executes, we know a castle is being created in memory, so we do want to increment the count. So just covering all corners here, I'm going to put 1 in this default constructor, the nothing constructor as I like to call it, and then also into the parameterized constructor. So again, looking at the parameterized constructor, we have a string for the name coming through, a string for the country. We have a date time type. I didn't notice that. That's for the year built, the year the castle was built, and then an image coming through the door. Okay. And just dumping those parameter values into the private data. This is our indirect access into the private data. And so again, when we create these objects, the castle objects, this constructor is the one that's going to execute, and we're populating those objects, those castle objects, with meaningful data as those objects are being created in memory, which is the whole point of the constructor. And then I just have my public properties here, which were auto-generated. Notice the static does have to have the static specifier there, but other than that, pretty straightforward. So that's the class. And I'll go over to the form 1, our main form, or our startup form. And up here at the class level, I've got a couple of things here. The array itself, which is, I'm calling it the castles, plural. I've created that to hold 3 castle objects. Now at the moment, when this executes, I have an empty container. I do not have any castle objects yet, but I will create them in just a moment. And then a current index variable, an integer, to keep track of where we are in the array as we're going back and next through the album. Okay, so then in the form load, this is a good place to do our housekeeping and create those actual castle objects and populate them with data. So we're using that parameterized constructor here, creating a brand new castle object, putting meaningful data into it, and notice with the date time for the year it was built, for the date time, we're parsing that. I just used, we're only interested in the year it was built. And a lot of these castles were built over, decades, if not centuries, by the people that lived in them. So it's really not 1 year, honestly, where a castle was built. But I'm just putting in January 1st as a placeholder for all of those. We're most interested in the year part. So that'll be parsed, and we'll look at how to pick the year out of that and ignore the January 1st part. But anyway, so creating these castles using that overloaded or the parameterized constructor, and then as we're creating them, we're putting them into the array, the castles array. Okay. I have an update controls using whatever castle, whatever, using the current index variable to kind of keep track of where we are in the array, and populating the controls on the form. Here is where we're updating the number of castles in the album, and we're reaching into that static data. Now recall that with static data, you don't access that through a specific object. Like, for example, the castle name, you're going to access for a specific object, whichever castle you're looking at the moment. And so we're reaching into the array, which has those castle objects, and then pulling out the data, the name, the country, and so on. Now, the static data is different. You don't call that for a specific object. You call it for the class on the whole. They're all looking at that one shared data member. So none of the individual castles has its own castle count. But the class itself has that data. So that's why we say castle dot, which is the class name, castle dot castle count. Okay, and then, yeah, just going back in next, and that's about it. Oh, and then, you know, the multi-form thing we have in this application as well. So again, adding a second form very easily. You just right-click the project name in bold. You add a new Windows form. Okay, you design it, and just to reiterate that when you're designing a form and putting the controls on the form from the toolbox and maybe writing some code, you're coding a class. You're coding a class. A form is based on a class, just like any other object in C#. And so then finally I have my form class coded, and that's as form 2, we're calling it. I know these are not really descriptive names, but so I'm going to launch form 2 from form 1, and I'm going to do that in the about option in the help menu. Okay, so I'm going to create a new instance of form 2. I'm going to call it FRM about, or FRM ABT. Just using that nothing constructor there. I didn't overload the constructor on form 2, okay? And then showing that new form, that's all. Okay, pretty easy. And that's it.